Just like he lived the rest of his life, he was a mixture of old and new, trying to make the two sort of balance out. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I would like to talk a little bit about the life of Quanah Parker, a man whose life began as a prehistoric warrior and finished with the last appointed chief of his people and a successful rancher, actor, and national traveler. I must tell you that when we started the series on some iconic Western figures and the weapons that they happened to use, I decided at some point I would try to tell some stories based on a Native American point of view. For me, I have a little bit of a personal connection with the character known as Quanah Parker. Quanah was, in fact, a half-breed born to a white captured settler and an Indian Comanche chief named Pita Nocona. Our story begins around 1836, when the Parker family relocated from Virginia to the grasslands of Texas. Back then, the government of Mexico was offering white settlers free land in perpetuity and 10 years worth of free taxes. What they didn't tell the white settlers is one of the reasons why they did that was a band of ferocious Indians called the Comanches. They lived in an area that the Spanish called Comanche, and the Mexicans had enough sense not to go up there, despite the fact that the Spanish had marched all through Mexico and Latin America relatively unchecked. That changed for them when they got to the grasslands of Texas and Oklahoma, a place we now call the Plains. Historians believe that the Comanche walked to the Plains, Oklahoma, Texas Panhandle from Wyoming. Before the Spanish introduced the horse in the 1500s, the Comanches were a tribe that was typically good at nothing. They weren't known as great farmers, no Indians really were, and it wasn't until the mastery of the horse that they would become true lord of the plains, feared not only by whites, but almost every other Indian tribe they encountered. In fact, one of the main reasons why the Apache moved to Arizona was at the end of the lance point held by the Comanche. The Comanche in 150 years became master of the Spanish horse, way more so than most European minds could ever get their head around. They were absolutely the best light cavalry the planet had ever seen, and white settlers were no match for the Comanches on the plains when they first settled there. What they would typically do is go out in small family settlements, which is what the Parker family did in 1836. Near a place that's presently called Groesbeck, Texas, they built something called Fort Parker, and some extended family members had pooled their land resources and decided to become ranchers. One day in 1836, Quanah's father, Pita Nocona, and around 150 Comanches showed up, and the Parkers, for unknown reasons, had left the main gate of their fort wide open. Of course, the Comanches raided, killed, and stole most of the people in the Parker family and took into captivity Cynthia Ann Parker, who would be Quanah's mother, and a cousin named Rachel. Rachel would escape 18 months later, permanently disfigured by her stay with the Comanche, which for a person her age, 17, wasn't unusual. Comanches really didn't raid white settlements any differently than they did any other Indian settlement. They would typically kill all of the males, only abduct the small children that were old enough to ride and not be a hindrance to them on their escape, and the babies were invariably murdered because they couldn't travel with them. Your goal on the raid was to take stuff you needed for survival and get out of Dodge, so to speak. Sometimes they would cover 45 to 60 miles in one single day after a raid. Cynthia Ann, in an odd twist of fate, would end up becoming Pita Nocona's wife. Throughout her childhood and into early adulthood, she was completely assimilated into the Comanche tribe, and her and Chief Nocona's first child was Quanah, born around 1845 to 1850. The date is unclear. He would, however, tell later on in life in the form of a letter, a rancher fellow named of Burnett, that he was born around 1850. This date of 1850 is a very significant date, not only in American history, but particularly in the history of Texas. The war with Mexico was over, and Texas found itself a fledgling nation. Because of this, there was really no government around to help protect them from the Indian tribes, and believe it or not, Quanah's grandfather, Cynthia Ann Parker's father, Silas, was one of the original members of the Texas Rangers, originally formed to protect white settlers from the Indians. How ironic is that? Not only is the period of 1850 reflective of American and Mexican history at the time, it also saw, as the country was being stitched together by railroads, the ultimate end of what would be the horse culture of the plains. Around 1871, when Quanah was around 20 or 21 years old, he was surely feeling the squeeze of American white settlers. You were watching the birth of the largest extinction of land mammals in the history of humanity in the hunting of the American buffalo and bison. The Comanche and other plains tribe used as almost their sole source of food and protection from the weather. So, in 1871, nobody really knew who Quanah Parker was because he was part of a sect of the Comanche called the Quahati. The Quahatis shunned all white people in general. They would rarely trade with white people, and because of this, they were spared a lot of the cholera epidemics that had wiped out a large portion of the Comanche population in years prior. In 1871, the American government would become aware of Quanah Parker because of a raid conducted by Reynold Mackenzie. Mackenzie was a Civil War veteran and had no idea what he was about to tangle with in a battle called Blanco Canyon. He was sent out with instructions to follow the Quahati home, so to speak, and eradicate them. The justification for this was a bunch of massacres that had occurred in the months prior. In fact, William Tecumseh Sherman was almost killed in one of these raids, but the Comanches decided to go attack a different settlement as he and an officer were on horseback surveying the immediate area. The Battle of Blanco Canyon was a complete wipeout for the American military. They had no idea what they were doing. At that time, they had no idea how to track and hunt Comanches, and they were using another tribe called the Tonkawas to track the Comanche. The problem with this was nobody told the American government that the Tonkawa had actually been wiped out mostly by the Comanches and had never beat them, ever. They always lost. And that was a tradition that we were about to continue at Blanco Canyon. The Battle of Blanco Canyon was set in motion by the American military to punish the Comanche for something they called the Salt Creek Massacre. Mackenzie was in charge of around 600 soldiers and 20 Tonkawa scouts. One of the largest mistakes they made during the battle for the canyon was Mackenzie, being very inexperienced, ordered a night march, not only making his men tired, they couldn't make their way through the scrub grass and the chaparral, and they gave their position away to the Comanche. That night, while exhausted, they also failed to not put out enough lookouts, so when the Comanche came in the middle of the night, an earmark of their raid, most of the Americans' horses were stolen, including Mackenzie's own gorgeous charger. The Comanche knew they couldn't go toe-to-toe with the American military, so they introduced them to a harsh reality of the raid, which was hit fast, steal what you can, kill as many as you can quickly, and still secure your own escape. It would be years before the American military, led by Mackenzie largely, a figure that's also almost lost to history, would learn his lesson and figure out how to combat that. Accounts vary, but some people have estimated that the Americans lost as many as 1,000 horses in that raid, which is really the only currency that the Comanche traded in or cared about. The Americans did everything possibly wrong, and their first glimpse into this fierce 6-foot-tall warrior known as Quanah Parker was a very, very unwelcome introduction. Over the next few years, Quanah's father, Pete Nakona, would die. He did, however, make some associations with some other chiefs, not only amongst the Comanche, but the Kiowa. This would become a very, very important period in Quanah's life, though we don't really know a lot of the details because he actually learned how to lead his people. Some would say later on down a very controversial direction. Around 1874, Quanah and some of his warriors were convinced by a medicine man to go out on a raid and as punishment for some of the damage and the encroachment upon their hunting rights that they had been incurring by the whites. This culminated in 1874 at the Battle of Adobe Walls. We've covered that battle a little bit before on the channel, and suffice to say that Quanah was very surprised by the long-range accurate rifle fire that could be laid down by the Sharps, to the point where he was actually wounded taking cover behind a buffalo hide. The round went into his neck and ended up in his shoulder. Wasn't serious, but it did limit the use of his arm for the rest of his life. After his escape at Adobe Walls, the following year, Quanah Parker found himself in the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon. This was the amount of time that was required for the American military to get online, concentrate its forces, and be actually a match in the field for the Comanche, a battle in which they won. That was a clear and present signal to Quanah Parker that he needed to take his people in another direction. This is where our story gets a little bit complicated, actually becoming a story within a story. Quanah's mother was actually recaptured by some Texas Rangers and hauled off into what she described as white captivity. She wanted nothing to do with whites. She was actually viewed several times in her lifetime before being reclaimed and refused to go back into white civilization. She was taken along with her daughter, Topsana, who had an illness and died. The loss of that child affected Cynthia Ann very greatly, and she starved herself to death rather than live as what she described as a white captive. A true Comanche woman, if I ever saw one. With some terrific immediacy, Quanah decided that his people needed to go on to the reservation and try to live as peacefully as they could with the whites. It's interesting to note that Quanah was never elected chief by his people. He played a lot of politics in his lifetime, and he knew instinctively that the chief was actually going to be picked by the American military in Fort Sill. So he kind of ingratiated himself to whites and powerful whites and tried to set up the best reservation system that he could for his people. It's a little bit controversial among Native Americans about whether or not he was a sellout or a patriot. Those are questions I, as a white person, don't think I get to ask or answer, so I'll leave that to the Native American community. But he is actually somewhat of a controversial figure in those circles. Quanah's intelligence was pretty much off the chart in the fact that he knew that the whites would have a hard time with the harsh environment being ranchers in the Texas Panhandle in Oklahoma, and that's exactly what happened. They suffered a 10-year drought and actually asked the Indians living on reservation if they could lease some of their lands, which Quanah did, and he became very rich. In fact, he had one of the largest houses called Star House. It exists to this day. We'll put some pictures of it on the board. And Taylor Sheridan, the writer of Yellowstone and 1883 and those series, has actually bought the movie rights to Quanah Parker's life and is trying to preserve the house. While on reservation, Quanah was a founder of the Native American religion, and yes, they did still allow peyote to be used during their religious services, even though Quanah was a professed Christian. Staying true to his Native American roots, he had 6 or 7 wives, fathered as many as 25 children, and always kept his hair long. He became such a friend of some white ranchers like the Goodnights and the Burnett's. The Burnett family still has Quanah Parker's war lance from all of those years ago, which I think is a remarkable gesture when he gifted it to them of what he thought of the Burnett family, who helped him become a successful rancher. Quanah Parker is an interesting figure, not only in the way that he tried to lead his people, but the times in which he lived. He began his life as a Stone Age mind, a prehistoric warrior whose people had never lived any differently. Yeah, they had had some contact with the Spanish, which they beat. They had had more contact with the Mexicans, which they beat. And they really didn't have any reason to think they wouldn't overcome the white settlers until Quanah Parker knew that they couldn't, that it was this or extinction, and he chose this. I don't think that makes him a bad character. I think it makes him a man deeply concerned for his people, trying to do the best he can. Now, some of the weapons that he preferred, for those of you guys that are into that sort of thing, Winchester 1873 was his favorite weapon. One of his rifles is still on display in museum. And other than that, he seemed to prefer traditional weapons. Tomahawk, the lance. Of course, he would use a pistol. You had to, if you wanted to survive most battlefield engagements. So, just like he lived the rest of his life, he was a mixture of old and new, trying to make the two sort of balance out. It's unfortunate that most people are not aware of the life of Chief Quanah Parker. When you think of great war chiefs, you think of Sitting Bull and perhaps Geronimo, which is a little unfair to Geronimo because he was more of a medicine man. But Quanah Parker really does not hit most people's minds as a great Indian chief, and he was. If you decide that in 1836 the war with the Comanches began on the raid on Parker Fort, then it's truly the longest war in American history. 4 decades the American military spent trying to succumb the Comanches before they were finally successful. It's one heck of a story within a story. And if you guys want to do a deeper dive on the topic, this is the book you need, Empire of the Summer Moon, written by S.C. Gwynne. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience, a few times. He's fascinating to listen to, and the way he guy writes, this is one of the best historical narratives I have ever read. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and we're going to pick some more figures in the future. And if you guys have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments.